Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our third edition of In the Beginning Was the Word. Started out a couple weeks ago just with talking about the importance of Bible study. Then last week we talked about John chapter 1 and looking at Jesus always being present, always being there. He was in there in the beginning with the Word, so he's always been there. But today we're going to go ahead and launch into John chapter 2. And before I do that, I want to go ahead and please apologize and beg for the forgiveness of our listeners, those that do check us out every week and wait for these to come out. I am running several hours behind. This should have come out this morning, and I'm full of excuses as to why not. But it was a late night and a very early morning this morning, so it just didn't get done. So I wanted to get it done now to make sure I get our message out for this week. But again, I do apologize. So let's go ahead and get started. So we're in John chapter 2. And today we're going to be diving into a powerful moment captured in John chapter 2 where we witness the transformative presence of Jesus at the wedding in Cana. The title of our message I wanted to call this today was When Jesus Shows Up. So imagine this joyous celebration, a wedding feast filled with laughter and dancing and the promise of new beginnings. Yet in the middle of all of this, we have a crisis. They've run out of wine. Now, this situation could have led to a lot of embarrassment for the hosts, but it becomes the perfect backdrop for a miraculous revelation of Jesus' power and compassion. In our lives, we often find ourselves in moments of need, confusion, and crisis. And it might even feel like the joy is running out and we're left wondering how things are going to get turned around. But here's the good news. Whenever Jesus shows up, everything changes. His presence brings hope, healing, and most importantly, transformation. So let's open our hearts to what it means to invite Jesus into our situations, allowing him to work miracles in our lives. So we're going to start in John chapter 2. We have 25 verses today. We're going to start with John chapter 2, beginning with verses 1 through 12. So read with me with John 2, verses 1 through 12. On the third day there was a wedding at Cana in Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus also invited to the wedding with his disciples. When the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now there were 6 stone jars there for Jewish rites of purification, each holding about 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water." And they filled them to the brim. And he said to them, "Now draw some out and take it to the master of the feast." So they took it. Then the master of the feast tasted the water now become wine, and he did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. The master of the feast called the bridegroom and said to him, "Everyone serves the good wine first. And when the people have drunk freely, then the poor wine. But you have kept the good wine until now." This is the first of his signs Jesus did at Cana in Galilee and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. And after this he went down to Capernaum, and his mother and his brothers and his disciples, and they stayed there for a few days. Now this story is rich in meaning and symbolism and lessons for our lives. But first let's look at the setting of the scene. The story begins on the third day of a wedding celebration in Cana of Galilee, a small town known for its hospitality. Now Jesus, his mother Mary, and the disciples were all invited guests. This setting highlights the importance of community and relationships, as weddings in Jewish culture were significant social events that could often last for several days. But in the midst of this celebratory event, a problem arises. And we see that in verse 3. During the festivities, a crisis occurs. They run out of wine. Now, in the cultural context of the time, running out of wine at a wedding would have been a serious embarrassment for the host and potentially even leading to social shame. Mary, noticing the situation, turns to Jesus and informs him, showing her awareness of Jesus' potential to help. And then in verse 4 we see Jesus' response. He replies to Mary, Woman, what does it have to do with me? My hour has not yet come. Now, while this may seem like a dismissive response, Jesus uses this term woman respectfully. His reply indicates that his mission and the timing of his works are governed by divine purpose rather than our human expectation. This moment in Jesus' ministry foreshadows a greater purpose for his ministry. Next, we see Mary's faith in her actions in verse 5. Despite Jesus' response, she turns to the servants and says, "Do whatever he tells you." This demonstrates a faith in Jesus' ability to address the problem, showing that she trusts him to act, even when his response seems so uncertain. This highlights the importance of obedience and faith in our relationship with God. And then in verses 6 through 8, we have the actual miracle. So Jesus instructs these servants to fill these 6 stone jars, each holding about 20 or 30 gallons. Now, I want to point out here that these stone jars were used for purification baths. So for in a military lingo, this was non-potable water, non-drinkable water that you would put in these containers. They were used for baths only. And after they filled them to the brim, he tells them to draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet. When he takes that drink, miraculously the water is transformed into wine. And this act reveals Jesus' divine authority over both creation and serves as his first public miracle, showcasing all his glory and his power. But I don't want to stop there. I want to keep going and talk about the quality of the wine, because the master of the banquet tries this wine and he's amazed, he's shocked, saying that most people serve the good wine first and then the less wine later, but Jesus has saved the best for last. This not only emphasizes the abundance and the quality of what Jesus provides, but it also symbolizes the new covenant that he brings, better and more fulfilling than that came before. What is the significance of this miracle? This passage concludes by stating that this was the first of Jesus' signs, revealing his glory and leading his disciples to believe in him. This miracle is more than just a display of power. It signifies the arrival of the kingdom of God, where joy, abundance, and transformation are accessible. Let's move on with verse 13. The Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple he found those who were selling oxen and sheep and pigeons and money changers sitting there. And making a whip of cords, he drove them all out of the temple with sheep and oxen, and he poured out the coins and the money changers that overturned their tables. And he told those who sold the pigeons, "Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of trade." His disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." This account of Jesus' cleansing of the temple in verses 13 through 22 showcases Jesus' authority, his passion for true worship, and the transition from the old covenant and into the new. Again, looking at the context here, we have a scene that is set during the Passover festival in Jerusalem, a time when Jews from all over the world would come to the temple to offer sacrifices and to celebrate. The temple was the center of all Jewish religious life, symbolizing God's presence among people, and that dates all the way back to Moses' time. But again, we have another problem that shows up in verses 14 and 15. Upon entering the temple, Jesus finds merchants and money changers conducting business. They were selling animals for sacrifices and exchanging currency, which was necessary because the temple required specific coins for offerings. However, this commerce had turned the sacred space into a marketplace and detracted from its intended purpose as a house of worship, or as we see even another time in the Old Testament, as a house of prayer. In response, Jesus makes a whip of cords, and he drives out the merchants, overturning their tables and scattering their coins. This act of righteous anger demonstrates a zeal for the sanctity of the temple and his tolerance for practices that corrupt true worship. And that's things we have to be careful of even today in today's church. But in verse 16, Jesus makes a declaration. As Jesus cleanses the temple, he addresses those selling doves, instructing them, "Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of trade." Now, this statement emphasizes that the temple is meant to be a place of prayer, worship, and not a place for commercial enterprise. Jesus highlights the importance of reverence for God's house. But in verses 17 and 18, I want you to look at the response of the disciples here and the Jews. The disciples recall a scripture that says, "Zeal for your house will consume me," reflecting Jesus' deep commitment to honoring God's presence. The Jews, witnessing Jesus' action, demand a sign to validate his authority for acting such a way. They're questioning his right to disrupt the temple activities, showing their misunderstanding of his real mission. But then, in verse 19, Jesus makes a prophetic statement. In response to their challenge, Jesus makes a profound declaration: "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." This statement is enigmatic of the Jewish leaders and signifies the transition from the physical temple to himself as the true temple. Now, Jesus here is foreshadowing his death and resurrection, indicating that he knew the dwelling place of God among his people. As we go on in verses 20 and 21, we see that there's a misunderstanding, but then a clarification. The Jews misunderstand what Jesus said, responding that it took 46 years to build this temple, implying that it would be impossible to build it in 3 days. This house that we're in now, we've only been here for a couple of years, but it took so long to build. So I can imagine if someone were to come up and say, "I can build your house in 3 days," I can kind of feel what the Jews were arguing here. It took us 46 years to build this temple. How would you be able to build it in 3 days? But John clarifies that Jesus was not speaking about the temple. He was speaking of the temple of his body, emphasizing that his resurrection would redefine our concept of worship, and it has. What was the purpose of this cleansing? After his resurrection, the disciples remember his words, and they believe in him. This moment serves as a catalyst for deepening their faith as they connect Jesus' actions to his identity and his mission. The cleansing of the temple becomes a pivotal moment in understanding Jesus as the fulfillment of the temple's purpose. To summarize this, the cleansing of the temple, it is a profound and multifaceted story that challenges us to reflect on our own worship practices, the reverence that we hold for God's presence, and the transformative power of Jesus as the new temple through which we encounter God. We have to be challenged to reflect on our own worship practices, and to make sure we're showing God the reverence that he deserves. All right, verse 18. Now the Jews said to him, "What signs do you show us for doing these things?" Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Jews then said to him, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and will you raise it up in 3 days?" But he was speaking about the temple of his body. When therefore he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed in the scriptures and the word that Jesus had spoken. In verses 18 through 22, we find a significant exchange between Jesus and the Jewish leaders following his cleansing of the temple. This passage not only reveals the authority of Jesus, but also foreshadows his death and his resurrection. Now, this follows the dramatic event of Jesus cleansing the temple, where he drove out the merchants who had turned sacred space into a marketplace, turned it into a mall. After witnessing this act, the Jewish leaders demand a sign, because if you're going to do this, you have to show us that you're the Messiah, demanding that he show a sign to justify his authority for taking these actions. So as the Jewish leaders asked Jesus, "What sign do you show us for doing these things?" This question reflects how their skepticism and desire for validation of Jesus' authority. Over and over again, they had to see it over and over again. This highlights a common theme in the Gospels, where the religious leaders often seek signs as a proof of legitimacy. However, their request also reveals a lack of understanding and recognition of Jesus' true identity and mission. But listen to Jesus' prophetic response in verse 19. He responds with a very provocative statement. Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. Now this statement is puzzling, profound, but it points to a deeper truth about his identity. Jesus is not referring to the physical temple. Instead, he's foreshadowing his own death and resurrection, as we've mentioned. This moment is a pivotal point in the gospel, indicating that the true temple, the dwelling place of God, is now found in Jesus himself. And of course, as we've mentioned throughout this, that seems to be a recurring theme throughout this chapter, we have a misunderstanding by our Jewish leaders. They respond with disbelief, stating that it took 46 years to build the temple, questioning how Jesus could then raise it up in 3 days. Their misunderstanding emphasizes a contrast between human perception and divine revelation. They're focused on the physical structure rather than grasping the spiritual truth that Jesus is conveying. Now this reflects a much broader theme in Jesus' ministry, where he often speaks in ways that challenge and confound the established religious understandings. But John clarifies that Jesus was speaking about the temple of his body. Now this explanation connects the physical temple to Jesus' own body, reinforcing that the idea that he was the ultimate fulfillment of God's presence among the people. This set the stage for understanding the nature of Jesus' mission. You see, he is the new temple, and through his resurrection, he establishes a new covenant relationship between God and humanity. And in verse 22, we see remembering and believing. After Jesus is raised from the dead, his disciples remember his words and believe both in him and the scriptures. Now this moment serves as a turning point for the disciples, illuminating their understanding of Jesus' identity and mission. It emphasizes the importance of remembering Jesus' teaching and the fulfillment of prophecy through his death and resurrection. Now, what does this mean to you and me? It gives us a better understanding of Jesus' authority. This passage challenges us to recognize and accept the authority of Jesus, not just in signs and wonders, but in his identity as the Son of God and the embodiment of God's presence. Second part is the nature of a true worship. Jesus' declaration about the temple indicates that the true worship is no longer confined to a physical space, but is found in a relationship with him. This invites us to reflect on where we seek God and how we engage in worship. Thirdly, faith in the resurrection. The connection between Jesus' death and resurrection is central to the Christian faith. We are called to believe in the power of the resurrection and everything it implies for our lives. And then lastly, we have a discerning spiritual truth. The misunderstanding of the Jewish leaders serves as a reminder to us to seek spiritual understanding beyond surface level interpretations. We are encouraged to dive deeper into our faith and the teachings of Jesus. Look at Acts 17:11. I say that all the time. Acts 17:11. Be like the Bereans, and go and look and see that the scriptures are say that what we say are so, to see that they are true. John 2:18 through 22 encapsulates a critical moment in Jesus' ministry, revealing his authority and foreshadowing the events of his death and his resurrection. It invites us to reflect on our own understanding of worship, the nature of our faith, and the significance of Jesus as the true temple. Now, as we close out here, let's start with verse 23. Now, when he was in Jerusalem at the Passover feast, many believed in his name when they saw the signs that he was doing. But Jesus, on his part, did not entrust himself to them, because he knew all people and needed no one to bear witness about man, for he himself knew what was in man. In these closing verses, this passage provides insight into Jesus' early ministry and the nature of his relationship with the people around him. These closing verses follow the narrative that Jesus' cleansing of the temple and take place during the Passover festival in Jerusalem. Now, during this time, there were many visitors in the city, and the atmosphere was most likely charged with religious fervor and even expectation. Many people believed in Jesus because of the signs and the miracles. We see this in verse 23. They believed in him because of the signs and the miracles that he was performing. And this reflects a common theme in the Gospels where signs and wonders draw people to faith. Their belief is often portrayed as superficial or based on a spectacle of miracles rather than a deeper personal faith in Jesus. This highlights the distinction between a faith that is grounded in miraculous experiences versus one that is rooted in a relationship with Jesus Christ. In verse 24, we see Jesus' discernment. Despite the people's belief, Jesus does not entrust himself to them. The phrase "did not entrust himself" implies that he was aware of their true intentions and even the nature of their faith. Jesus understands the human heart. He understands me, he understands you, and he knows that many who believe in him during this time may not have a genuine, lasting commitment. This discernment emphasizes Jesus' divine insight into human nature and the difference between genuine faith and faith that is merely reactionary. And lastly, in verse 25, we see that he understands human nature. Verse 25 states that Jesus needed no one to bear witness about man because he knew what was in man. Jesus' understanding of human nature means that he sees beyond outward appearance and our declaration of faith. He knows our motivations. He knows our doubts. He knows our inconsistencies in each and every individual. This serves as a reminder that God sees our hearts and knows our true selves, prompting us to engage in honest self-reflection. What does this mean for you and me? What does this mean for us? A genuine faith. The passage challenges us to examine the foundation of our faith. Are we following Jesus for what he can do for us, or are we committed to him for who he is? The second one is our awareness of our hearts. Understanding that Jesus knows what is in our hearts and encourages us to be honest with him about our doubts, our struggles, and our desires. It invites a deeper relationship that is rooted in authenticity. To let him know, Lord, this is what I want, but it's selfish to want that. Thirdly, the nature of signs and wonders. Now, while signs and wonders can lead to belief, they should not be the sole basis for our faith, because true faith involves a personal relationship with Jesus that transcends the need for constant miraculous validation. We don't need him to constantly perform miracles for us to prove that he loves us. Lastly, we have Jesus' sovereignty. The passage emphasizes that Jesus is not swayed by public opinion or by popularity. He remains focused on his mission and the hearts of the individuals, rather than merely their outward expression of belief. And verses 23 through 25 serves as a beautiful reminder of the nature of faith and the importance of sincerity in our relationship with Jesus. While many were drawn to him by his miracles, Jesus' wisdom and understanding of human nature reveal a call for deeper and heartfelt commitment. This passage invites us to reflect on our own beliefs and motivations as we seek to follow Christ authentically and genuinely. As we conclude our exploration of John 2 this evening, we have witnessed the transformative power of Jesus in two significant events: the miracle at the wedding of Cana and the cleansing of the temple. Each moment reveals profound truth about who Jesus is and what it means to follow him. First, at the wedding of Cana, we see Jesus as the source of joy, but also the source of transformation. He takes what is ordinary and plain, water, and he turns it into something that is extraordinary, wine. This miraculous act reminds us that Jesus is present in our celebrations and in our struggles, ready to bring abundance and joy in our lives. When we invite him into our situations, we open ourselves to the possibility of change and renewal. Then we move to the temple, where Jesus demonstrated a zeal for true worship and his authority over what is sacred. He calls us to examine our own hearts and practices, reminding us that worship must be genuine and centered on him and not centered on me. Just as he cleansed the temple, we are invited to allow him to cleanse our hearts, removing distractions and anything that hinders our relationship with God. Sometimes we have to take Christ's side against ourselves. As we reflect on these themes, let's consider how we respond to Jesus' presence in our lives. Are we like those at the wedding, willing to trust him to transform our ordinary moments? Or are we more like the merchants at the temple, needing a reminder to prioritize our relationship with God over our distractions and even over our routines? As I close this week, may we seek to nurture a faith that is not merely reactionary, but deeply rooted in knowing Jesus as both Savior and Lord. And let's embrace that he offers and commit ourselves to genuine worship, authentic worship, allowing him to shape us into vessels of love and grace. Well, that's it for this time. As you can see, we're back home now, so I'm back in the comfort of my office a little bit. So good to be back home. Although we did have a wonderful time last week, it has been wonderful to get back in here and get back into the Word to share with you guys on Monday morning. Again, I want to apologize one last time for being late on our Monday morning devotion, but I hope this finds you fairly early on a Monday evening, so that you can get your dose of the Word this week in John chapter 2. But until next time, let your faith ignite a fire in the hearts of others. Have a great week.